On April 16, 73 AD, Roman auxiliary scouts ascending the western face of Masada made a discovery that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Beneath the final sections of the massive siege ramp, partially buried in compacted earth and stone, they found the skeletal remains of over 300 horses, their bones bearing marks of exhaustion, dehydration, and deliberate sacrifice. The animals had been worked to death, their bodies incorporated into the very structure meant to conquer the Jewish fortress above. One cavalry officer's journal, preserved in the dry Judean air, recorded the moment. "We built our victory on a foundation of suffering that shamed even Mars himself." But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about the siege of Masada horses, how a 3-year siege killed hundreds of cavalry mounts through heat, labor, and Roman military desperation, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from today. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers around the world. Now let's descend into one of history's most overlooked atrocities. The year is 70 AD, and the Roman Empire stands at the height of its power. Jerusalem has fallen. The Second Temple lies in ruins, its sacred flames extinguished by Titus's legions just months earlier. Across Judea, the smoke of conquest still rises from destroyed settlements, and the roads are crowded with Jewish refugees fleeing Roman retribution. But the First Jewish-Roman War is not quite over. High atop a massive plateau in the Judean desert, nearly 1,300 feet above the Dead Sea, stands Masada, an ancient fortress complex originally built by King Herod the Great. Its sheer cliffs make it virtually impregnable. Its storerooms, carved deep into the rock, hold enough grain, oil, and wine to sustain a population for years. Its cisterns capture the rare desert rains with architectural genius, providing fresh water in a landscape of death. Here, approximately 960 Jewish zealots have made their final stand. Men, women, and children, families who chose resistance over submission. They are led by Eleazar ben Yair, a descendant of Judas of Galilee, a man whose hatred of Rome burns hotter than the desert sun that beats down upon the fortress walls. These are not soldiers in the traditional sense. They are farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and their families. But they are united by a faith that transcends fear and a determination that Rome will soon learn to respect. The Roman 10th Legion, Legio Ex Fretensis, arrives in the autumn of 72 AD, under the command of Lucius Flavius Silva. 8,000 soldiers, thousands of Jewish prisoners pressed into slave labor, and something else, a cavalry contingent of nearly 600 horses, the finest mounts from Syria, Cappadocia, and Gaul. These animals represent Rome's military might, each one worth more than a common soldier's annual pay. They are warhorses, trained for battle, bred for endurance. Silva surveys the fortress from below and knows immediately that traditional siege tactics will fail. The cliffs cannot be scaled. Starvation will not work. Herod's storerooms are too well stocked. Battering rams cannot reach walls perched on a mountain. He faces a simple, terrible choice: abandon the siege and admit defeat, or attempt something unprecedented in military engineering. He chooses the impossible. He will build a mountain to reach a fortress on a mountain. The decision is made in a command tent as the sun sets over the Dead Sea. Silva's engineers present their calculations. They will construct a massive earthen ramp on the western face of Masada, the only side where the cliffs are marginally less sheer. The ramp will rise nearly 700 feet, with a gentle enough grade to allow siege towers and battering rams to be hauled to the fortress walls. It will require hundreds of thousands of tons of stone and earth. It will take years, and it will require beasts of burden. In those first weeks, no one imagines what this decision will cost. The horses graze peacefully in the Roman camps below, still strong from their journey, still valuable, still alive. Their handlers brush their coats and check their hooves, not knowing they are tending animals already condemned to death. The Judean desert is not kind to horses. The temperature soars to 120 degrees Fahrenheit during summer days. Water sources are scarce and heavily guarded. The terrain is rocky, unforgiving, hostile to everything that lives. But Silva's orders are clear: the ramp must be built. And in the Roman military machine, orders are absolute. The first horses begin to die in November of 72 AD, just 6 weeks into the construction effort. A Syrian mare named in the cavalry logs simply as Unit 12 Mount 7 collapses while hauling a stone-laden cart up the partially completed ramp. The animal had been worked for 11 consecutive hours under the desert sun, A Legion veterinarian examines the body and notes in his report, extreme dehydration, heart failure. The animal consumed less than half the required water ration, meat salvaged for auxiliaries. It is treated as an isolated incident, one horse among 600. The construction continues. By December, the pattern becomes undeniable. 3 to 4 horses are dying each week. The symptoms are consistent: dehydration, heat exhaustion, hoof damage from the rocky terrain, injuries from falling stones, and sheer physical collapse from overwork. The cavalry officers begin filing complaints with Silva's headquarters. These are military assets being destroyed for construction labor. Horses trained for battle, some worth a year's wages for a common soldier, are being used as pack mules in conditions that would challenge even camels. Tribune Marcus Antonius Julianus, commander of the cavalry auxiliary, writes directly to Silva, "The horses cannot sustain this labor in these conditions. We are losing mounts at an unacceptable rate. I request permission to withdraw the cavalry contingent and requisition proper draft animals, oxen, donkeys, or camels, for the construction work." Silva's response is preserved in the military archives discovered centuries later. Request denied. The ramp must be completed with all available resources. Adjust water rations and work schedules as necessary, but maintain construction pace. Failure to meet engineering targets will be viewed as dereliction of duty. The message is clear. The horses are expendable. The ramp is everything. January of 73 ad brings new horrors. The construction has reached a critical phase. The ramp is now several hundred feet high, and the grade is becoming steeper. Horses hauling materials must strain against increasingly heavy loads while climbing a slope that grows more treacherous daily. The animals begin to stumble. Some fall, tumbling down the ramp and dragging their handlers with them. Legion engineers, desperate to meet Silva's deadlines, devise a brutal solution. They begin building the horses into the ramp itself. A centurion's personal letter, discovered in the 1960s among papyrus fragments at a nearby Roman camp, describes the practice with horrifying casualness. When a beast falls and cannot rise, we simply build over it. The body provides structure, and the work continues without delay. The Jewish prisoners seem disturbed by this, but they are slaves and have no voice in military matters. A dead horse is merely another stone in our great construction. The Jewish prisoners forced to work on the ramp witness something that violates every principle of their faith. Animals suffering without mercy, bodies desecrated and treated as building materials. Some prisoners, according to later testimonies, refuse to work and are executed on the spot. Others continue, traumatized, knowing that refusal means death, but compliance means participating in an atrocity. From the Fortray. Above, the zealots can see everything. They watch the ramp grow slowly toward them. They see the horses struggling, falling, dying. They see the bodies incorporated into the earth and stone. Eleazar ben Yair speaks of it in his final speeches to the defenders, fragments of which are preserved by Josephus. The Romans build their conquest on cruelty. They care nothing for the beasts of the field, and they will care nothing for us. They are not men. They are a plague that devours everything in its path. By February, the cavalry contingent has lost over 200 horses, more than 1/3 of their original force. The survivors are gaunt, their ribs visible through dull coats, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Cavalry officers plead again for permission to withdraw the remaining animals. Again, they are denied. What happens next reveals the depths of Roman military pragmatism and cruelty. Silva issues a new order. The weakest horses are to be slaughtered intentionally and their bodies used as ramp fill material. This serves two purposes. It provides structural material for the construction, and it reduces the number of mouths requiring precious water rations. The healthiest horses will be preserved for the final assault, when cavalry will be needed to pursue any zealots who attempt to flee Masada. The slaughter begins on February 12, 73 AD. 67 horses are killed in a single day. The method is efficient and cold. A spike driven into the brain, instant death, and immediate incorporation into the ramp. The surviving cavalry mounts can smell the blood of their companions as they continue their labor, hauling stone and earth over ground that contains the bodies of animals they once grazed beside in Syrian pastures. A Greek physician attached to the legion, a man named Demetrius who later defects to Parthia, writes in his memoirs, "I have seen battles. I have seen men die in every manner war can devise, but the systematic destruction of those noble beasts, worked to death and then entombed in the very structure of Rome's pride, haunts me still. We were not at war with horses, we were not enemies of creation, yet we treated living creatures as mere fuel for our ambition, If the gods are just, this sin will be remembered long after our empire crumbles to dust. March brings the final phase of construction. The ramp is nearly complete, rising like a scar on Masada's western face. Only 50 horses remain alive from the original 600. These survivors are skeletal, their eyes reflecting a suffering beyond description. They can barely walk, much less pull loads, yet they are driven forward by handlers who themselves are numb to the atrocity they're perpetrating. And then, on April 2nd, 73 AD, something breaks in the Roman camp. A junior cavalry officer named Gaius Septimus Rufus releases 12 horses during the night watch, opening the corral gates and driving the animals toward the open desert. It is a futile gesture. The horses are too weak to survive in the wild, but it is an act of rebellion born from moral disgust. Rufus is caught before dawn. The horses are recovered. Silva orders Rufus crucified as an example of what happens to those who sabotage military operations. But before he dies, Rufus shouts something that ripples through the Roman ranks. "We are building our victory on innocent blood. The gods will judge us for this. Rome will fall, and this ramp will stand as a monument to our cruelty." The crucifixion takes place within sight of the ramp. The remaining cavalry officers are forced to watch. The horses continue their labor, and the zealots on the fortress walls above see it all. The execution of a Roman who showed mercy, the suffering of animals who never chose this war, the grinding machinery of empire that consumes everything in its path. April 16, 73 AD. The ramp is complete. The siege tower is in position. The battering ram breaches Masada's walls. But what the Romans find inside transforms this military victory into something hollow and haunting. The zealots are dead, all 960 of them. Mass suicide committed the night before to deny Rome the satisfaction of conquest. Eleazar ben Yair's final speech, recorded by the 2 women and 5 children who survived by hiding in the water cisterns, echoes with defiance. "Let our wives die unblemished, and our children without knowledge of slavery. After that, let us do each other an ungrudging kindness, preserving our freedom as a glorious winding sheet." The Romans walk through silent corridors filled with bodies. Families lie together. The fortress is intact, the storerooms still full, the weapons piled neatly. There is no battle. There is no glory. There is only death chosen freely over submission. But it is the auxiliary scouts, exploring the base of the completed ramp in the days after the fortress falls, who make the discovery that will haunt this place forever. As they dig to stabilize sections of the massive earthwork, they uncover the bones. Hundreds upon hundreds of horse skeletons, layered throughout the ramp structure like some grotesque fossil record of suffering. The bones tell their own terrible story: fractures from overwork, hoof damage from the rocky terrain, signs of dehydration and malnutrition visible even in the skeletal remains. Some skeletons are complete, suggesting the animals were intentionally killed and placed in the ramp. Others are fragmentary, scattered among the stones, indicating horses that died during construction and were simply built over where they fell. One scout's report, filed with his century commander, captures the horror. The entire western approach is a graveyard of beasts. Every stone we move reveals more bones. Some are so fresh the flesh has not fully decomposed in this dry air. Others are already bleached white by the sun. We built this ramp with our hands, with Jewish slave labor, and with the bodies of 600 horses who never understood why they suffered. I request reassignment. I cannot sleep knowing what lies beneath where we walk. Silva orders an inventory. How many horses did the siege actually consume? The final tally is devastating. Of the 596 cavalry mounts brought to Masada at the siege's beginning, only 38 survived to return to Syria. 558 horses dead, 93%, 6% casualty rate. More horses died at Masada than in many major battles of the Jewish-Roman War. The legion's chief engineer, a man named Lucius Cornelius Verus, conducts a structural analysis of the ramp and files a report that is buried in military archives until modern archaeological excavations bring it to light. He writes, "The ramp measures approximately 450 feet at its base, tapering to 70 feet at the top, rising to a height of 340 feet. The total volume of material required was approximately 11,000 cubic meters. Of this, we estimate that animal remains constitute 3 to 5% of the total mass. This includes not only horse bodies but also refuse from pack animals and food animals slaughtered during the 3-year siege. The western approach to Masada is, in essence, a monument built partially from the remains of the beasts we destroyed to create it. But what authorities discover next would chill even the hardened Roman soldiers. Within the skeletal remains, there is evidence of something beyond overwork and environmental casualties. Some horse skeletons show signs of deliberate violence, skulls struck with spikes, bones bearing cut marks where meat was harvested, and positioning that suggests ritual placement rather than random burial. The Romans had not merely worked horses to death. In the final months of construction, facing water shortages and supply difficulties, they had begun systematically slaughtering and consuming the cavalry mounts, then incorporating the remains into the ramp as a grotesque form of recycling. A Jewish survivor, one of the women who hid during the mass suicide, provides testimony to Roman authorities in Jerusalem. Her words are recorded in Josephus's later histories. From the fortress walls, we watched the Romans destroy their own animals. We saw the handlers weep as they killed horses they had cared for. We saw the bodies dragged to the ramp and thrown into the earth. And we understood that Rome would do the same to us, use us until we broke, then build their empire on our bones. That is why we chose to die free rather than live as their materials. The archaeological evidence from modern excavations confirms these ancient accounts. In the 1960s, Yigal Yadin's team excavating Masada discovered horse bones mixed with the ramp's earth and stones. Carbon dating placed them to the exact period of the Roman siege. Forensic analysis revealed the patterns of stress, malnutrition, and trauma consistent with the historical descriptions. The bones were real, the suffering was real, the atrocity was real. In the immediate aftermath of Masada's fall, Roman authorities face an uncomfortable question: what to do with a victory built on such systematic cruelty to military animals? The answer, preserved in military correspondence between Silva and Governor Sextus Vetulinus Cerealis in Caesarea, reveals the pragmatic brutality of imperial administration. Silva writes, "The ramp is complete, the fortress is taken, the Jewish rebels are eliminated. That the construction required the sacrifice of cavalry mounts is regrettable but militarily necessary. I recommend we document the engineering achievement and minimize discussion of the resource costs. The emperor need not be troubled with details of animal casualties. He should know only of Roman triumph." Cerealis agrees. The official dispatches to Rome describe Masada as a brilliant engineering victory. They detail the ramp's construction as a testament to Roman military genius. They praise Silva's determination and the 10th Legion's discipline. They mention the zealots' mass suicide as proof of Rome's terrifying power. They say nothing about the horses. But among the soldiers who participated in the siege, silence is impossible. The cavalry officers in particular return to their units carrying psychological scars. Tribune Marcus Antonius Julianus, who commanded the auxiliary, cavalry, writes a letter to his brother in Gaul that survives in a French monastery library. "I left for Judea with 600 of the finest horses in the empire. I returned with 38, broken, traumatized beasts who flinch at the sight of stones. I watched noble animals suffer for 3 years in conditions no creature should endure. I obeyed every order, fulfilled every duty, and I am rewarded with promotion and honors. But in my dreams I hear those horses screaming. I see them falling on the ramp. I smell the blood from the slaughters. I am haunted not by the enemies I've killed, but by the innocent beasts I destroyed in service of Rome's pride." Several cavalry officers request transfers or early retirement. Some simply disappear from the historical record, suggesting desertion or discharge due to mental trauma. One, a Syrian auxiliary named Avidius Cassius, not to be confused with the later usurper of the same name, is documented as having refused to participate in further cavalry operations and being discharged without honor. The Jewish prisoners forced to work on the ramp carry their own nightmares. Those who survive the siege scatter across the empire, some eventually settling in Rome itself. Generations later, their descendants share stories passed down through families, stories of building a mountain of death, of watching animals suffer, of participating in an atrocity they were powerless to prevent. One such account, recorded in a 3rd century rabbinic text, speaks of the great sin at Masada, where the Romans built their victory on the suffering of beasts who bore no guilt. The Torah commands us to care for animals, even the oxen that thresh grain, but the Romans cared nothing for creation. They consumed everything: land, water, beasts, and people, in their hunger for dominion. This is why God will judge them. In Rome itself, news of the Masada siege spreads gradually. Emperor Vespasian, who initiated the campaign against Judea when he was still a general, receives Silva's official reports and declares the Jewish war officially concluded. Triumphal celebrations are held. Coins are minted showing Judea as a mourning woman beneath a palm tree, with the inscription Ivdaia capta, Judea captured. Silva is honored with triumphal ornaments, but whispers circulate in the Roman Forum and the Senate about the true cost of the Masada victory. Opposition senators, seeking any weapon against Vespasian's Flavian dynasty, begin questioning the resource expenditure of the siege. How much did this symbolic victory actually cost? How many soldiers died? How many siege resources were consumed? And how many horses? Senator Gaius Helvidius Priscus, a known Stoic philosopher and critic of the Flavian regime, raises the issue publicly in a Senate debate documented by Tacitus. We are told of a great victory at a desert fortress, but at what cost? I have heard from returning soldiers that we sacrificed 600 cavalry mounts, 600, to build a ramp against rebels who then denied us even the satisfaction of conquest by taking their own lives. This is not military genius. This is obscene waste. This is cruelty masquerading as strategy. Priscus is subsequently exiled and later executed, ostensibly for other political offenses, but his questions linger. They circulate in intellectual circles, in philosophical discussions, in the whispered doubts of a society beginning to question the moral costs of empire. The military establishment responds with bureaucratic efficiency. New regulations are drafted regarding the use of cavalry horses in siege operations. Future campaigns will require separate draft animals for construction work. Cavalry mounts will be reserved strictly for combat operations. Water and feed rations for animals in desert regions are increased and standardized. These reforms come too late for the 558 horses who died at Masada, but they represent a grudging acknowledgement that something went terribly wrong in the Judean desert. The Roman military machine, for all its efficiency and power, had revealed itself capable of systematic cruelty not just to human enemies, but to the innocent animals caught in the machinery of conquest. The 10th Legion itself is permanently stationed in Judea following the war, garrisoning Jerusalem and the surrounding territory, but the legion is haunted by what it built at Masada. Graffiti discovered on walls in the legion's Jerusalem barracks includes disturbing references. We climbed a mountain of bones. The horses watch from the stones. Masada's ramp remembers. Decades later, when the 10th Legion participates in the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132-136 AD, desertion rates are notably higher than other legions. Some historians attribute this to the psychological trauma of the previous campaign, the unhealed wounds of participating in atrocities that violated even the rough moral codes of Roman military culture. Silva himself lives another decade, serving as governor of Judea and later retiring to his estates in Hispania. But his personal correspondence, fragments of which survive, suggests a man troubled by his legacy. In a letter to a fellow general he writes, "I achieved what I was ordered to achieve. The fortress fell. The rebellion ended. But when I close my eyes, I see that ramp rising against the cliff, and I know what lies within it. History will judge me a successful commander. I am not certain the gods will be so generous." He dies in 81 AD, never having returned to Masada after the siege ended. The siege of Masada and the fate of the horses consumed in its prosecution reverberate through history in ways both tangible and symbolic. What happened on that desert plateau becomes a dark mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about empire, cruelty, and the costs of victory measured in suffering. In the immediate aftermath, the Roman military implements substantial reforms regarding animal welfare in siege operations. The regulations drafted in 74 AD establish minimum water and feed rations for horses in desert climates. They mandate rest periods and limit consecutive work hours for beasts of burden in extreme conditions. They prohibit the use of cavalry horses for heavy construction labor, except in emergency situations. These reforms are not born from compassion but from cold military calculation. The loss of 558 cavalry horses at Masada represented an enormous financial cost. Nearly 600 years of a common soldier's wages destroyed over 3 years. The empire could not afford to repeat such waste in future campaigns. Yet the regulations have an unintended consequence. They represent one of the earliest examples in Western military history of codified animal welfare standards. Later empires studying Roman military practices will adopt and expand these principles. The Byzantines, the Ottomans, and eventually European armies develop increasingly sophisticated codes regarding the treatment of military animals. The line of influence runs directly from the Masada disaster through centuries of military evolution. The siege also fundamentally changes how Rome approaches desert warfare. Future campaigns against Nabatea, Parthia, and desert tribes consistently employ local draft animals, camels and donkeys adapted to arid conditions, rather than valuable cavalry horses for logistical work. The lesson is learned: environment matters, and forcing animals into conditions they cannot survive is both cruel and tactically foolish. But the broader implications extend beyond military reform into the realm of moral philosophy and religious thought. Jewish tradition preserves the Masada story as a testament to choosing dignity over submission. But within that narrative, the fate of the horses becomes a parable about the nature of evil. The zealots who died at Masada are remembered as martyrs who chose their own deaths. The horses had no such choice. They suffered and died for a conflict they could not understand, in service to humans who viewed them as expendable resources. Rabbinic commentary in the centuries following the siege frequently references the Masada horses when discussing the Torah's commandments regarding animal welfare. The principle of Sa'ar Ba'ale Ka'im, the prohibition against causing unnecessary suffering to living creatures, is strengthened and elaborated in response to the Roman atrocity. If Romans could work animals to death for military glory, Judaism must stand in moral opposition, affirming the sanctity of all creation. Early Christian writers also grapple with the Masada narrative. While Christianity spreads through the Roman Empire, there is tension between honoring Roman authority and condemning Roman cruelty. The horses of Masada become a safe vehicle for this criticism. Church fathers like Tertullian write scathingly about Roman excess and cruelty, using the siege as evidence of pagan moral bankruptcy. They built their monument on innocent blood, Tertullian writes, the blood of beasts who knew no sin. What God do they serve who commands such waste? This rhetorical strategy, criticizing Rome through the lens of animal cruelty rather than direct political opposition, becomes a pattern in early Christian literature. It allows dissent while avoiding persecution. And it places animal suffering within a moral framework that will influence Western ethics for centuries. The philosopher Plotinus, writing in the 3rd century, uses Masada as a thought experiment in his discussions of the one and suffering. If the universal soul permeates all creation, he argues, then the suffering of the horses at Masada diminishes the cosmic whole. Their deaths matter not because they are strategically valuable, but because they are part of the interconnected reality of existence. This Neoplatonic interpretation influences later Christian theology regarding creation care and the moral status of animals. In the medieval period, as the Crusades bring European knights into the same Judean landscape where the siege occurred, Masada becomes a cautionary tale. The ruins of the fortress stand intact. The great ramp remains visible, a testament to Roman engineering and Roman cruelty. Crusader chronicles describe visiting the site and being shown by local guides where the horse bones were discovered. One such chronicle, from a French knight named Geoffrey de Villehardouin, records, "We saw the great ramp built to conquer the Jewish fortress, and our guides told us it was constructed from earth, stone, and the bodies of 600 noble horses. I thought of my own destrier, Tonnerre, who has carried me faithfully through 3 campaigns. I prayed that Christian knights would never sink to such barbarism as to sacrifice our loyal companions for mere engineering. Yet the Crusades themselves repeat the pattern. Desert campaigns consume vast numbers of horses. Richard the Lionheart's 3rd Crusade loses hundreds of cavalry mounts to heat, disease, and overwork. The parallels to Masada are not lost on contemporary chroniclers, several of whom explicitly reference the Roman siege as a warning against the strategic and moral costs of desert warfare. The archaeological rediscovery of Masada in the 19th and 20th centuries brings the horse tragedy back into public consciousness. When Yigal Yadin's team excavates the site in 1963 to 1965, finding and documenting the horse bones within the ramp, international media coverage focuses not just on the zealots' last stand, but on the animals who died in the siege. The bones become physical evidence of an atrocity, lifting the story from ancient text into material reality. Modern animal rights movements seize upon Masada as historical precedent for contemporary concerns. If the Romans could systematically work hundreds of horses to death for a military objective, what does that reveal about humanity's capacity for rationalized cruelty toward animals? The siege becomes a case study in how institutions, military, governmental, imperial, can normalize atrocity through bureaucratic distance and dehumanizing language. Military assets, resource expenditure, necessary sacrifice. The terminology strips away the reality of individual animal suffering. Military historians analyzing Masada debate whether Silva's decision to use cavalry horses for construction labor was justified by military necessity. Some argue that in siege conditions, all resources must be utilized. Others contend that the loss of so many valuable mounts represented a catastrophic failure of logistics and planning. The debate mirrors contemporary ethical discussions about means and ends, about whether victory can justify any cost, about where moral lines should be drawn even in war. Environmental historians point to Masada as an early example of ecosystem destruction in service of human conflict. The siege consumed not just horses but vast quantities of water, timber, and local vegetation. The Dead Sea region's ecology was damaged in ways that persisted for generations. The horses are the most visible victims, but they were part of a larger pattern of environmental exploitation that characterizes empire building throughout history. Perhaps most significantly, Masada forces us to confront the question of moral witness. Thousands of people participated in or observed the destruction of those 600 horses. Roman soldiers, Jewish prisoners, cavalry handlers, engineers, and slaves all saw the suffering. Most remained silent, either from fear, indifference, or acceptance of military authority. Those few who objected, like the cavalry officer Gaius Septimus Rufus who released horses and was crucified for it, paid with their lives or careers. What does this reveal about human nature and institutional evil? The same question that haunts the Holocaust, My Lai, Abu Ghraib, and countless other atrocities. When do ordinary people become willing participants in cruelty? How do institutions normalize the unthinkable? What enables conscience to overcome obedience? The horses of Masada cannot answer these questions. They suffered and died without understanding the human conflicts that consumed them. But their bones, preserved in the dry Judean air and discovered 2 millennia later, stand as testimony to a truth we continually rediscover: that the measure of civilization is not in its monuments or military victories, but in how it treats the most vulnerable and voiceless among us. The great ramp at Masada still stands today, weathered by 2,000 years of desert wind but fundamentally intact. Tourists climb it, marveling at Roman engineering. Guides explain the siege, the zealots' defiance, the mass suicide. Some mention the horses, most do not. But the bones remain within, a foundation of suffering beneath human feet, a reminder that empires are built on more than ambition and stone. They are built on the accumulated suffering of all those, human and animal, consumed in the machinery of conquest. What do you think drove Silva and the Roman military to sacrifice 600 cavalry horses for a symbolic victory? Was this military necessity or institutional cruelty? Could anything have justified the systematic destruction of these animals? The siege of Masada reveals how empires normalize atrocity through bureaucratic distance and the language of necessity. The horses weren't seen as living beings but as military assets and resource expenditures. That dehumanizing or de-animalizing language allowed thousands of people to participate in or witness their suffering without effective resistance. We see the same patterns throughout history, whenever institutions convince people that cruelty is justified by greater goals. The horses of Masada challenge us to ask, where are the lines we won't cross? What suffering will we refuse to rationalize? When will we choose conscience over obedience? Leave your theories in the comments. Tell us what you think this dark chapter of ancient history reveals about human nature, about empire, about the costs of victory measured in innocent suffering. If you found this lost chapter of history compelling, make sure you're subscribed to Fear Sermon and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest corners of the past. Share this video with someone who appreciates history's uncomfortable truths. Next time, we'll uncover another buried story that challenges everything you thought you knew about the ancient world. Until then, remember, history's greatest monuments are often built on foundations of suffering. The question is whether we're willing to look beneath the surface and confront what lies there. See you in the next video.